The economy doesn't just shape lives anymore. What if it quietly controls them? Fact 1. If economic pressure were used as a hidden weapon, it wouldn't start with tanks or headlines. It would start with your grocery bill. Prices wouldn't just rise randomly, they would rise strategically, targeting essentials first. Food, fuel, housing, the things Americans can't opt out of. The goal wouldn't be collapse, but control. When people spend all their energy surviving, they stop questioning bigger systems. In this scenario, inflation becomes less of a problem and more of a tool, one that quietly shifts power without a single shot fired. Fact 2. What if job instability wasn't just economic reality, but intentional pressure? Imagine a system where layoffs spike not because companies fail, but because uncertainty keeps people compliant. When workers fear losing income, they're less likely to protest, switch careers, or challenge authority. The American middle class, once defined by stability, would slowly become risk-averse and silent. On the surface, it looks like market fluctuations. Underneath, it's behavioral control through financial fear, subtle, effective, and nearly impossible to prove. Fact 3. Credit could become one of the most powerful invisible levers, not just access to money, but access to opportunity itself. If economic pressure were weaponized, credit scores might quietly dictate who gets ahead and who stays stuck. A slightly lower score could mean higher interest, fewer options, delayed progress. Over time, entire groups of people could be slowed down without ever being directly restricted. It wouldn't feel like control, it would feel like personal failure, and that's what makes it so effective. Fact 4. But here's where it gets complicated. Economic pressure isn't only destructive, it can also drive innovation. If used differently, it could push industries to adapt, reduce waste, and create smarter systems. High cost could force efficiency, scarcity could inspire breakthroughs. The same pressure that limits people can also sharpen them. The real question isn't whether economic pressure exists, it's who controls it and whether it's being used to build resilience or quietly reshape behavior. Fact 5. If economic pressure were used as a hidden weapon, it could quietly reshape where Americans are able to live. Housing prices wouldn't just rise randomly, they would rise in patterns that push certain income groups out of key areas. Over time, entire cities could become financially gated without any official policy saying so. This wouldn't look like forced relocation, but the effect would be similar. People would move not by choice but by necessity. At the same time, this pressure could also revitalize overlooked regions, shifting growth into new areas. Fact 6. Access to healthcare could become another subtle pressure point. If costs rise faster than wages, people begin delaying treatment, avoiding checkups, and making decisions based on finances instead of health. In a weaponized scenario, this wouldn't be accidental. It would be predictable. A financially stressed population is physically weaker and more focused on short-term survival. However, on the positive side, this pressure could accelerate innovation in cheaper healthcare models, telemedicine, and preventive care systems designed to reduce long-term costs and dependency. Fact 7. Education could shift from a pathway to opportunity into a filtering mechanism. If tuition continues rising and debt becomes unavoidable, fewer people take risks on different careers or creative paths. Instead, they choose safe options that guarantee repayment. In a controlled economic pressure system, this narrows thinking across an entire generation. But there's another side. High pressure could also push alternative education models forward. Trade skills, online learning, and non-traditional paths could become more valuable, reshaping what success looks like in America. Fact 8. Perhaps the most powerful effect would be psychological. If people constantly feel financial strain, their perception of reality changes. Long-term planning disappears. Trust in institutions weakens. Communities become more divided because everyone is competing for stability. But here's the paradox. Shared pressure can also unite people. History shows that economic hardship sometimes creates stronger local communities, mutual aid, and new movements. The same force that isolates individuals can, under the right conditions, push them to reconnect and rebuild something more resilient together. Fact 9. If economic pressure were used deliberately, small businesses would feel it first and hardest. Access to loans could tighten, supply costs could rise unpredictably, and regulations could become just complex enough to slow growth. Large corporations with reserves and influence would survive. Local businesses, the backbone of American communities, could quietly disappear. But there's another side. Pressure often forces small businesses to innovate faster, adopt digital tools, and find niche markets. The same force that eliminates some could make others more resilient, adaptive, and competitive than ever before. Fact 10. Consumer behavior would begin to change in subtle but powerful ways. If people feel constant financial pressure, they stop spending freely and start prioritizing essentials. Entire industries, entertainment, travel, luxury goods, could shrink, not because people don't want them, but because they no longer feel safe spending. This kind of shift could slow economic growth. At the same time, it could create a more financially disciplined population. Savings rates might increase, debt might decrease, and long-term financial awareness could improve, even if driven by fear rather than choice. Fact 11. Economic pressure could also influence information itself. Media, platforms, and even independent voices often rely on funding, advertising, or sponsorships. If financial pressure is applied strategically, certain narratives could be amplified while others quietly disappear. Not through censorship, but through incentives. People wouldn't necessarily notice what's missing, only what remains visible. On the positive side, this pressure could push audiences to seek independent sources, diversify where they get information, and become more critical of what they consume, strengthening long-term media awareness. Fact 12. Global influence could shift without a single military action. If one nation applies economic pressure effectively, through trade, currency, or supply chains, it can shape the decisions of others. Alliances might form not around shared values, but around financial survival. For Americans, this could mean changes in job markets, prices, and global standing without clear explanation. However, it could also force stronger domestic production, reduce reliance on foreign systems, and encourage economic independence, making the country more resilient in the long run. Fact 13. Perhaps the most overlooked effect would be generational. If economic pressure continues over time, it doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes how entire generations think. Younger Americans might grow up valuing security over ambition, stability over innovation. Risk-taking declines. Big ideas become rare because failure feels too expensive. But there is a counter-effect. Some individuals respond to pressure by pushing harder, building new systems and rejecting old limitations. In that sense, economic pressure doesn't just control behavior, it divides people into those who adapt, and those who redefine the system entirely. Fact 14. If economic pressure were used strategically, retirement could become one of the most sensitive control points. Rising living costs and unstable markets could quietly force people to delay retirement, even after decades of work. This wouldn't be framed as pressure, it would be called economic reality. But the result is clear, a workforce that stays active longer, not always by choice. On the other hand, this same pressure could push individuals to plan earlier, invest smarter, and build multiple income streams, creating a generation that is more financially aware than any before. Fact 15. Debt could become a long-term behavioral anchor. If people carry constant financial obligations, mortgages, student loans, credit, they become less mobile, less willing to take risks, and more predictable. In a system where pressure is intentional, debt isn't just financial, it's psychological. It ties decisions to obligation. But there is a flip side. Awareness of this pressure could lead people to avoid unnecessary debt, prioritize ownership over consumption, and seek financial independence earlier, reducing long-term vulnerability. Fact 16. Supply chains could be used as invisible pressure points. Shortages wouldn't need to be extreme, just enough to create uncertainty. Small disruptions in fuel, food, or materials could ripple through the economy, raising prices and creating stress. Most people wouldn't see the cause, only the effect. However, these disruptions could also expose weaknesses in the system, encouraging local production, stronger infrastructure, and more self-sufficient communities that rely less on fragile global networks. Fact 17. Work culture itself could shift under economic pressure. If people feel financially insecure, they are more likely to accept longer hours, fewer benefits, and less flexibility. Over time, this redefines what is considered normal in the workplace. But pressure doesn't only push in one direction, it can also lead to backlash. Workers may demand remote options, better conditions, or alternative income paths. Entire movements around work-life balance and fair compensation could grow stronger precisely because the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Fact 18. Ultimately, trust becomes the real battlefield. If economic pressure shapes daily life without clear explanation, people begin to question institutions, systems, and even each other. Confidence in stability weakens. Markets, government, and corporations are no longer seen as predictable. But this loss of trust can trigger two very different outcomes. It can divide society further, or it can force transparency, accountability, and reform. When enough people feel the pressure, they don't just adapt to the system, they start demanding to understand and change it. Fact 19. If economic pressure were applied intentionally, energy costs could become one of the most powerful levers. Fuel, electricity, heating, these affect every household and business. Small increases don't cause panic, but they slowly change behavior. People drive less, spend less, and rethink daily routines. Entire industries adjust quietly. But there's another side to this pressure. High energy costs could accelerate investment in renewable sources, local energy production, and efficiency technologies, potentially making communities less dependent and more resilient over time. Fact 20. Migration within the country could shift in ways that feel organic, but aren't entirely random. If certain states or regions become too expensive, people move, not because they want to, but because they have to. Over time, this redistributes populations, labour markets, and political influence. It doesn't look forced, but the outcome is powerful. At the same time, this movement could revitalise smaller towns, reduce overcrowding in major cities, and create new economic hubs that were previously overlooked. Fact 21. Savings could quietly become a dividing line between stability and vulnerability. In a system under pressure, those with savings gain flexibility. They can wait, adapt, and make better decisions. Those without it react under stress. Over time, this widens inequality without any visible policy change. But pressure also teaches discipline. More Americans could begin prioritizing emergency funds, reducing reliance on credit, and thinking long-term. The same pressure that exposes weakness could also build stronger financial habits across entire communities. Fact 22. Technology adoption could accelerate not just from innovation, but from necessity. If economic pressure increases costs and reduces margins, businesses are forced to automate, optimize, and digitize faster than planned. This could increase efficiency and productivity across industries. However, it also means fewer traditional jobs and a workforce that must constantly adapt. For individuals, this pressure could lead to continuous learning and new opportunities, but only for those who can keep up with the pace of change. Fact 23. Social mobility could become less visible, but more difficult. The idea that anyone can move up remains part of the American identity, but under sustained economic pressure, the path becomes narrower. Costs rise faster than opportunities, and small setbacks become harder to recover from. It wouldn't look like barriers. It would feel like exhaustion. Still, pressure can create alternative paths. Entrepreneurship, remote work, and decentralized industries could open doors that didn't exist before, even if the traditional path becomes harder. Fact 24. Over time, economic pressure could redefine what success means in America. Instead of expansion, people might prioritize stability. Instead of risk, they choose predictability. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, shaping culture itself. But pressure can also reset values in a positive way. People may focus more on community, self-reliance, and long-term security rather than short-term gains. In that sense, economic pressure doesn't just influence markets, it reshapes identity, priorities, and the direction a society chooses to move. Fact 25. If economic pressure were used intentionally, insurance systems could become a silent control mechanism. Rising premiums for health, home, and auto wouldn't just reflect risk, they could shape behavior. People might avoid certain areas, careers, or even lifestyles simply because they become too expensive to insure. Over time, this creates invisible boundaries without laws. However, This pressure could also drive innovation in risk management, smarter infrastructure, and preventative systems, potentially lowering long-term costs and making individuals more aware of how their decisions affect financial security. Fact 26. Access to transportation could quietly influence economic freedom. If fuel prices, vehicle costs, or public transport availability shift strategically, mobility itself becomes limited. People may take jobs closer to home, reduce travel, or avoid opportunities that require relocation. This doesn't look like restriction, it feels like practicality. At the same time, pressure on transportation could accelerate remote work, digital services, and decentralized economies, allowing people to earn and contribute without being physically tied to one place. Fact 27. Food systems could become another subtle point of pressure. If production costs rise or supply chains tighten, food prices increase in ways that reshape daily habits. People switch to cheaper options, reduce quality, or change diets entirely. Over time, this affects health, energy levels, and overall well-being. But this same pressure could also encourage local farming, home gardening, and more sustainable food systems. Communities might become less dependent on large-scale supply chains and more connected to their own sources of food. Fact 28. Financial pressure could redefine entrepreneurship itself. Starting a business might become riskier, with higher costs and less margin for error. Fewer people would take that leap, slowing innovation in some areas. But those who do move forward would likely be more calculated, strategic, and resilient. Pressure filters out impulsive decisions and forces stronger foundations. In this way, economic pressure doesn't eliminate entrepreneurship. It transforms it into something more deliberate and potentially more sustainable. Fact 29. Time becomes a hidden cost under economic pressure. People begin working more hours, taking on multiple jobs, or sacrificing rest to maintain stability. This doesn't just affect income, it changes quality of life, family dynamics, and mental health. Over time, society becomes more exhausted and less engaged. Yet, this pressure can also force a re-evaluation of time itself. People may seek efficiency, automation, or alternative lifestyles that prioritize balance, leading to new ways of structuring work and life. Fact 30. In the end, economic pressure could shape not just behavior, but belief. If people consistently experience financial strain without clear causes, they begin forming their own explanations. Narratives emerge, some accurate, some not, and these beliefs influence decisions, trust, and even national identity. This can lead to division, suspicion, and instability. But it can also spark awareness. When enough people start asking the same questions, pressure doesn't just control the system anymore, it exposes it. Fact 31. If economic pressure were used intentionally, taxation could become more than a funding tool. It could shape behavior at scale. Subtle increases or incentives could guide what people buy, where they invest, and how they structure their lives. It wouldn't feel like control, but over time, choices narrow. However, taxation pressure can also be used constructively. It can encourage cleaner energy, local investment, and long-term financial planning. The same system that limits options can also guide society toward more sustainable and stable outcomes if applied transparently. Fact 32. Banking access could quietly determine who participates fully in the economy. If fees rise or lending standards tighten, some individuals and small businesses get excluded without any official barrier. This creates a system where participation feels open, but isn't equal. Over time, entire communities could operate at a disadvantage. Yet this pressure could also accelerate alternatives, decentralized finance, community banking, and peer-to-peer systems. When traditional access tightens, innovation often fills the gap, creating parallel systems that challenge existing structures. Fact 33. Economic pressure could influence family decisions in ways people rarely discuss openly. Choices about having children, buying homes, or caring for aging parents become financial calculations first, personal decisions second. Over time, this reshapes demographics and social structures. Fewer risks are taken, and long-term commitments are delayed. But pressure can also lead families to become more strategic, more united, and more intentional about planning. It forces conversations that might otherwise be avoided, creating stronger long-term stability for those who adapt. Fact 34. Even personal freedom can feel different under constant financial strain. Technically, opportunities still exist. People are free to move, change careers, or start over. But when every decision carries financial risk, freedom becomes limited by consequence. This doesn't require laws, only pressure. However, awareness of this limitation can be powerful. It can push individuals to seek independence, reduce reliance on fragile systems, and build lives that are less vulnerable to external economic shifts. Fact 35. At its highest level, economic pressure could redefine power itself, not through visible authority, but through influence over daily decisions. When people adjust behavior without being told, the system becomes self-enforcing. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize. But history shows something equally important. Pressure always creates resistance. When individuals begin to see patterns, ask questions, and connect experiences, the same force that shapes behavior can trigger change, reform, and new systems built on greater transparency. If pressure is shaping everything, are we adapting or being quietly directed? Tell me what you think.